Evelyn had just ordered her bodyguard to remove the single father from the lobby when the entire glass tower shuddered, and every emergency light flipped to red. Mason did not resist. He simply stood and stared at the blinking control panel, warning the elevators would lock down in 47 seconds. Evelyn immediately assumed he was threatening her company. But exactly on schedule, steel doors slammed shut and the security system spiraled beyond anyone's control. Jackson went pale, leaned close to her ear, and whispered the sentence that would change everything that followed. "Ma'am," he whispered firmly, "we need him. If you truly believe worth is never measured by appearance alone, stay close as Mason slowly uncovers this entire conspiracy." The story began inside the polished lobby of Auraline Systems, on the night the company planned to unveil Sentinel Core, its new intelligent security platform. Hundreds of investors, reporters, and board members filled the marble atrium, waiting for Evelyn to announce what everyone already called the largest contract in the firm's history. Chandeliers threw soft gold light across the room, and champagne glasses clinked in anticipation of a night meant for triumph. Screens along the walls displayed the Sentinel Core logo, promising a future where no building anywhere could ever be caught unprepared. Into that gleaming order walked a man who did not belong there at all, at least not by appearance. Mason wore a worn work jacket, boots still marked with grease, and carried a small metal case sealed with an old mechanical lock. He had just come from an emergency repair job across town and had not found time to change before rushing over. The woman at the reception desk searched the guest list twice and found no trace of his name anywhere on it. Mason asked to see Joseph, insisting that the backup power system beneath the building was producing a dangerous oscillation pattern he had noticed from an external terminal. He did not raise his voice, yet he refused to leave, certain that hundreds of people inside could be in real danger if nothing was done. At that exact moment, Evelyn arrived with Jackson at her side and Adrian trailing just behind them both. Adrian recognized Mason instantly, though he pretended otherwise, keeping his expression carefully blank as though facing a total stranger. Leaning toward Evelyn, he murmured that this man had once been dismissed from the company for sabotaging critical systems, a claim that instantly hardened her posture. Mason tried to explain that Joseph himself had called him there that evening, but his phone could not reach Joseph to confirm it, and the growing silence on the other end only made Evelyn more certain that something about his story did not add up. Evelyn, already under intense scrutiny from reporters gathered outside, viewed the stranger's presence as a calculated disruption aimed at wrecking her launch. She gave the order for Jackson to escort him out before the ceremony began. Mason did not fight the decision. Instead, he glanced at the panel of warning lights near the entrance and began counting silently, timing something only he seemed to understand. He warned that within 47 seconds, the elevators and fire doors throughout the tower would lock automatically. Evelyn assumed he intended to frighten her into compliance. Then, precisely when Mason predicted, the entire structure trembled. Warning lights turned red across every visible panel, steel doors dropped into place, elevators froze between floors, and cellular signal vanished from the building entirely. Jackson's memory flickered back to an old safety file, one that listed Mason's name inside an appendix about manual override procedures. He leaned close to Evelyn and spoke the words that would alter the course of everything to come. "Ma'am," he said under his breath, "we need him." A cold automated announcement echoed through the lobby a moment later, warning that the power core was climbing in temperature, yet rejecting every attempt the control center made to intervene. Guests who had been laughing over drinks only seconds before now stood frozen, staring upward as red light washed over the marble columns. Somewhere above them, a woman's voice cried out that her floor had gone completely dark, and nobody near the reception desk knew how to answer her. Evelyn reluctantly canceled her order to remove him, though she gave Mason only a handful of minutes to explain himself before she called security back. Mason quickly determined that the red lighting was no ordinary fire alarm, but a signal that Sentinel Core had isolated itself entirely from human oversight. Lucas connected his laptop to the mainframe, only to find every administrator password rejected without explanation. Adrian pushed Evelyn to authorize an immediate remote restart, insisting it was the fastest way to regain control. Mason stopped them before the command could be issued, warning that a restart would shift the entire electrical load onto battery cells that were already dangerously overheated. Adrian mocked him openly, suggesting a freelance repair technician could not possibly understand a system this advanced, and reminded everyone within earshot that Mason had once been quietly dismissed for reasons the company had never fully explained. Mason ignored the insult and pointed instead to a flickering cycle on the display, explaining each signal in plain, unhurried language anyone in the room could follow. He predicted the ventilation system would seal itself within 12 seconds. The prediction proved exactly correct. Warm air began pressing into the atrium and panic rippled through the gathered crowd as people fanned themselves and edged toward the doors. Evelyn realized this could not possibly be a performance staged by a man with no digital access whatsoever to the network. Whoever had built this crisis had done so from deep within the system itself, far beyond anything a stranger from the street could manufacture on a whim. Jackson reported that more than 60 guests were trapped across the upper floors, and one elevator carrying several board members had lost its magnetic braking entirely. Mason asked Lucas to cut auxiliary line number 3 using the manual breaker switch. Lucas hesitated, since current documentation listed that very line as the primary source feeding the braking system. Mason insisted the blueprint had been altered and that the true power source instead ran through line number 5. Evelyn now faced an impossible choice between trusting official paperwork or trusting a man she had ordered removed only minutes earlier. She gave him 3 minutes to prove it. Mason and Lucas pried open the control panel and discovered that the wiring labels had indeed been swapped sometime earlier. They cut the correct line just in time, halting the elevator before it could plunge into the mechanical floor below. The passengers trapped inside were safe for now, though still unable to escape the sealed compartment. Their frightened voices carried faintly through the intercom, and Mason promised through the small speaker that help was already on the way, his tone steady enough to calm the room. Mason's precision left Evelyn visibly shaken, while Adrian's composure began to crack at the edges. Mason asked where Joseph could be found. Adrian claimed Joseph had resigned months earlier and was nowhere near the building tonight. Jackson quietly checked an offline security log and discovered Joseph's access badge had been used inside the tower less than an hour before. A new number blinked across the overhead display, showing 72 minutes remaining before the battery core would reach a full chain reaction. Jackson's expression tightened as the timer refreshed itself, and for the first time that evening, Evelyn understood that pride alone would not save the people trapped inside her own building. She glanced once more at Mason, who had not moved from his position beside the panel, still calmly reading numbers that meant nothing to anyone else in the room. As the group prepared to descend toward the mechanical floors, the story turned back to reveal who Mason truly was before that night. Years earlier, Mason had been the youngest safety architect Auraline Systems had ever hired, admired for a mind that treated every wire and valve as part of a living system. He discovered that Adrian had quietly approved a cheaper battery shipment that failed to meet basic heat tolerance standards. Mason filed a report demanding the installation be halted immediately, yet the report vanished from the internal system within days, as though it had never existed at all. Soon after, a power failure struck the testing facility during a routine trial. Access logs were altered to suggest that Mason himself had disabled the protective safeguards that night, though he had done nothing of the kind. Adrian used the manufactured failure to force Mason out of the company entirely, framing him as reckless and dangerous to public safety, a portrait so convincing that even Mason's own colleagues eventually stopped returning his calls. Evelyn, newly appointed as chief executive at the time, signed the dismissal based entirely on the report Adrian handed her, never once speaking with Mason directly to hear his side of events. Mason lost his professional license, his savings, and the reputation he had spent years building from nothing. He could not afford a lengthy legal battle while raising his daughter alone, and every attorney he approached warned that fighting a company as powerful as Auraline would likely take years he simply did not have. His daughter, Grace, never appeared directly in the unfolding events, mentioned only through a brief message Mason received before the signal in the building was lost entirely. The message reminded him softly that he had promised to come home early, and made clear he had never intended to remain in that tower for long. Joseph remained the only person who never stopped believing Mason had been wronged. Over the following years, Joseph quietly gathered paper copies, invoices, and component serial numbers, tucking them away for a day he hoped would never come. That afternoon, Joseph had called Mason and warned him that Adrian intended to run the entire faulty battery shipment under full load during the very ceremony meant to celebrate the company's success. Joseph also revealed that someone inside the tower was working to erase every remaining trace of evidence before the night ended. Back in the present moment, Evelyn asked why Mason had never simply brought everything to the authorities. Mason answered plainly that suspicion alone was never enough to convict a man protected by an entire board of directors. The metal case he carried held a mechanical key of his own design, one that could not control the whole system, but only restore human authority once someone reached the correct chamber. That chamber sat far below, hidden behind 3 layers of doors now sealed shut by Sentinel Core itself. Evelyn decided to accompany Mason, Jackson, and Lucas down into the depths of the tower, while Adrian offered to remain upstairs and reassure the frightened guests. Mason noticed how quickly Adrian had volunteered to separate himself from the rest of the group, a detail that lingered uneasily in his mind long after the elevator doors had already closed behind them. As the door to the service stairwell finally creaked open, Mason spotted a severed sensor wire cut cleanly with a tool rather than damaged by any accident, proof that human hands were behind everything unfolding that night. Mason led the group down the service stairwell instead of risking the compromised elevators. The air grew steadily warmer as they descended, lights flickering while fire doors sealed shut behind them, one after another. Evelyn still kept her distance from Mason physically, though she had quietly begun listening to him rather than issuing commands of her own. Lucas admitted that the old mechanical schematics had been removed from training programs at Adrian's specific request years earlier, a detail that now felt anything but innocent. Mason understood then that Adrian had been preparing for this exact night for a very long time, methodically erasing the small pieces of knowledge that might one day allow someone to stop him. It was a patient kind of sabotage, built slowly enough that nobody had ever noticed the pattern forming beneath their feet. On one of the lower floors, they heard trapped voices behind a sealed electronic door. Evelyn wanted to stop and free them immediately without hesitation. Mason warned that opening the door improperly would trigger a full seal across the entire stairwell, trapping everyone, including themselves. He used a small piece of metal from his toolkit to bridge the pressure sensor temporarily, allowing the door to open without setting off any alarm. The group guided the frightened employees out and pointed them toward the safer upper floors, one young woman thanking Mason quietly before hurrying up the stairwell with the others. The act revealed something important about Mason, that he valued saving lives far more than proving any point about his own innocence. He never paused to remind anyone what he had already accomplished, moving instead straight toward whatever danger came next. Evelyn began to feel a quiet shame settle over her, realizing she had judged this man entirely by his clothing and by an old file she had never bothered to question. Adrian's voice crackled over the internal radio, urging them to turn back since rescue crews had supposedly already arrived outside. Jackson checked an independent camera feed near the exterior entrance and found no rescue teams whatsoever waiting there. Adrian claimed the signal must simply be delayed somewhere along the way. Mason recognized that Adrian was buying time, stalling until the battery cells crossed a point beyond anyone's control. The group pressed onward toward the maintenance section below. In one narrow corridor, the ventilation fans suddenly reversed direction, pushing hot smoke straight back toward them. Mason and Jackson worked together to seal the manual air valve by hand before the smoke could spread further. Evelyn nearly lost her footing as a pressure door swung shut, but Mason pulled her clear just before it could strike her. He offered no lecture and no blame, only a firm request that she stay focused on the path ahead. Evelyn steadied herself against the corridor wall, breathing hard, and for a moment simply nodded without finding any words to answer him. They eventually reached the calibration room, the very location where Joseph's badge had last been recorded that evening. The door was locked from the outside with a heavy metal bar, unmistakable proof that whoever was inside had been deliberately trapped there. Jackson forced the bar loose, and together they found Joseph slumped unconscious beside a stack of paper records that had been partially set alight. Smoke still curled faintly from the charred edges of the pages, and Evelyn realized with a sinking heart that someone had tried very hard to make sure nobody would ever read them. Joseph remained alive, though badly disoriented from a lack of oxygen inside the sealed room. Mason and Evelyn carried him into the corridor, where the air was noticeably easier to breathe. Once he regained his senses, Joseph confirmed that Adrian had sent him down to the calibration room under a false pretense. Adrian had taken his access badge, locked the door from outside, and attempted to burn the original report before anyone could stop him. Joseph had hidden the most critical pages inside a fireproof compartment moments before losing consciousness. The surviving documents showed that the battery serial numbers installed throughout the tower did not match the batch that had actually passed inspection years earlier. Tens of millions of dollars in cost difference had quietly moved through shell companies secretly controlled by Adrian himself. Mason noticed his own signature attached to an old approval form buried within the papers, a signature he immediately recognized as close, but subtly wrong in a way only he would ever notice. He pointed out that the signature had been created after the date his access to the system had already been revoked, which made the entire document impossible. Evelyn realized, with a growing weight in her chest, that the very decision to dismiss Mason had been built entirely upon a forged record. It was the moment she understood that she herself had played a part in destroying an innocent man's life. Still, Mason did not allow her to sink into guilt while hundreds of people remained in danger throughout the building. There would be time to grieve mistakes later, he told her quietly, but not while the clock above them kept counting down toward disaster. Joseph revealed the true shape of Adrian's plan. It was never only about erasing evidence of corruption. Adrian had secretly wagered against the company, betting that its stock price would collapse following a major technical disaster. A hidden investment fund under his control stood ready to buy the company at a fraction of its worth once the crisis was over. Sentinel Core had been engineered to create exactly that kind of disaster, while still leaving Adrian a private escape route through the underground parking structure. Hannah reached them through an old analog line and reported that the mainframe was automatically feeding false information out to every news outlet covering the launch. The story being broadcast painted Mason as a disgruntled former employee who had broken into the tower to cause the entire catastrophe. Adrian was turning Mason into a scapegoat for the second time in his life, using the very same trick that had already cost him everything once before. Evelyn instructed Hannah to protect the original records and reach federal investigators immediately. Before Hannah could finish the call, the line went dead. A screen down the hallway flickered to life, displaying Mason's photograph beside a security alert demanding his immediate capture, the crude image looking almost nothing like the calm man standing quietly beside her. The remaining security staff received direct orders to detain him wherever he was found. Jackson now faced a choice between the official chain of command and the truth standing directly in front of him. He stepped between the approaching guards and Mason, declaring aloud that he alone would answer for whatever came of his decision. Moments later, the countdown display suddenly dropped from 50 minutes down to only 28, the unmistakable sign that Adrian had just triggered a maximum load test somewhere deep within the tower. Adrian appeared on the communication screen and declared that he had personally uncovered the true cause of the entire crisis. He presented a supposed access log showing Mason's mechanical key connecting to Sentinel Core several hours earlier. Evelyn wavered as she stared at the data since the authentication marker on the screen appeared entirely legitimate. Adrian pressed her to order Jackson to seize Mason before he could cause any further destruction to the tower. Mason did not run. Instead, he calmly handed the metal key directly over to Jackson. He told Evelyn that if she truly believed him guilty, she should hold him there, but insisted Lucas be sent immediately to cut the main power line regardless. Mason's composure only made Evelyn's decision harder to reach, because everything about the way he stood there suggested a man who had already made peace with whatever happened next, guilty or not. Lucas examined the key and discovered it was entirely mechanical, containing no transmitter of any kind whatsoever. Because of that simple fact, it could never have produced any electronic access record at all. Mason pointed to one small detail buried in the data, that the timestamp format on Adrian's supposed log used a newer system, while the isolated core serve still ran on an older format entirely. The log had clearly been generated from an outside machine, not from within the sealed tower itself. Evelyn realized Adrian was manipulating her through the very thing she trusted most, her unwavering faith in cold data over human judgment. She gave the order to cancel the alert against Mason immediately. Adrian responded by locking Evelyn out of her own executive authority, proving he had already seized control of the administrative system long before that night began. The building's speakers announced that Evelyn no longer held sufficient authority to direct operations during an active emergency. Several board members gathered in the lobby quickly turned toward Adrian, convinced Evelyn had lost control of the situation entirely. It was the lowest point of the night for her, stripped of power while simultaneously confronting the consequences of a mistake she had made 3 years earlier, a mistake she had never once thought to question until this very hour. Mason reminded her that a title could never open the door in front of them, but her choices right now still could. The words settled something inside Evelyn, steadying her breathing and her resolve at once. She thought of all the reports she had signed without ever once looking up from the page to meet the eyes of the person they affected. In front of Jackson, Lucas, and Joseph, she formally handed technical command of the crisis over to Mason, the first time that night she had openly placed her trust in him without reservation. Mason quickly split the group into 3 separate tasks. Jackson would protect Joseph, Lucas would work to restore the ventilation system, and Evelyn would accompany Mason toward the core chamber below. Before they departed, Joseph pressed half of the surviving mechanical blueprint into Mason's hands, explaining with a pained expression that Adrian had taken the other half for himself sometime earlier that evening. Mason studied the incomplete drawing and realized with a sudden chill that Adrian was not fleeing the building at all. He was moving directly toward the core chamber to trigger the final stage of his plan by hand, unwilling to trust even his own carefully built system to finish the job without him. Mason and Evelyn moved together through a narrow service tunnel leading toward the power core section of the tower. It was the first time all night the two of them had been alone long enough to speak honestly with one another. Evelyn admitted she remembered signing the order to dismiss Mason in less than 3 minutes, barely reading past the first paragraph of the report in front of her. At the time, she had wanted to prove to the board that she was tough enough to lead a company as large and demanding as this one. Mason did not offer forgiveness right away, nor did he try to comfort her with easy words. He told her plainly that her decision had cost him years of a career he had worked hard to build from nothing, years he could never fully get back no matter how the night ended. Yet he also said that saving innocent people mattered more tonight than any anger he still carried inside him. Evelyn began to understand that Mason's steady kindness was not weakness at all. It was instead a form of self-control most people could never manage, especially when they had every reason in the world to seek revenge. She wondered quietly what kind of person she might have become if their positions had somehow been reversed. Somewhere behind her own composed exterior, she suspected she already knew the answer, and it troubled her more than she cared to admit. They reached a door that could not be opened with the mechanical key Mason still carried in his pocket. He recalled the tower's original design and found a hidden access panel tucked behind a cluster of pipes nearby. Evelyn had to crawl into the tight space and turn an internal valve exactly as Mason instructed from just outside. For most of her career, she had stood at a comfortable distance giving orders, but now she found herself directly performing dangerous work with her own hands. Her first attempt at the timing was wrong, and pressure inside the pipe spiked sharply as a result. Mason did not scold her. Instead, he guided her calmly through a second attempt, describing each motion in the same patient tone he might have used with someone he had trained for years, and this time the door finally released. Meanwhile, Jackson and Lucas found themselves blocked by 2 security staff members still loyal to Adrian somewhere in the corridor above. Jackson tried reasoning with them, showing pieces of evidence, but the 2 men had already been promised money to help Adrian escape unnoticed. A brief confrontation broke out in the narrow maintenance hallway. Jackson managed to subdue both men without endangering anyone nearby, though he suffered an injury to his shoulder in the process, a sharp pain he chose to ignore rather than slow the group down any further. He pressed forward anyway, continuing to guard Joseph while clearing a path for Lucas to reach the ventilation controls. Hannah, working through an old restored line, reported that federal investigator Connor was already stationed outside the building, though the sealed fire doors still prevented his team from entering. She described his voice as calm and businesslike, the sound of someone who had clearly waited through worse nights than this one before. Evelyn asked Hannah to transmit every surviving document directly to Connor before the system could erase anything further, aware that once the files left the tower, there would be no undoing what came next for Adrian. The core chamber trembled as the battery cells continued swelling from the intense heat building inside them. Mason quickly realized Adrian had removed the copper contact piece, the single component needed to connect the mechanical key to the primary breaker. Evelyn felt despair creeping in as every path forward seemed suddenly blocked, the walls of the chamber closing in around her like the last few minutes of a nightmare she could not wake from. Mason studied the floor and noticed fresh drag marks leading toward a nearby tool cabinet. Adrian had not carried the piece far, since the metal itself was still far too hot to hold for long. Mason found it, though the insulation coating had already been badly damaged by the heat. To reinstall it properly, he needed to cut local power for exactly 18 seconds while the work was completed. Lucas needed to control the cooling valve at precisely the same moment. Jackson needed to release a mechanical lock from the corridor outside. Evelyn had to hold a pressure lever steady by hand, since the automated controller had already been disabled. The entire group coordinated through the old analog line, a system Adrian could not interfere with no matter how hard he tried, each voice crackling faintly through static as instructions passed from one person to the next. The plan nearly collapsed when Jackson's injured shoulder slowed his movements at a critical moment, his fingers fumbling once against the cold metal lock before finally catching hold of it. Joseph, still weak from his ordeal, stepped in to hold a secondary switch in his place. Mason installed the contact piece in the final second available to him. The main power line severed cleanly, and the temperature inside the chamber began dropping almost immediately, the metal around them ticking softly as it began to cool for the first time in nearly an hour. Lights throughout the tower flickered back on. The steel doors partially reopened, and a wave of relief swept through the crowd still gathered in the lobby above. Evelyn allowed herself to believe for just a moment that the crisis had finally ended, and she let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the ceremony first began. Mason noticed something else entirely, a valve overhead ticking with the wrong rhythm. He quickly discovered that the inert gas fire suppression system was being manually triggered from somewhere else in the building. If the gas released while the doors on the lower level remained closed, everyone still working below would be starved of breathable air within minutes. Adrian had prepared one final measure, intended to eliminate Mason, Evelyn, and Joseph together, erasing every witness who could testify against him, and leaving nothing behind but a tragedy the company could quietly blame on faulty equipment. A fresh countdown appeared on the display, showing 6 minutes before the inert gas would flood the chamber completely. Adrian contacted them again, claiming he was already inside the parking garage, ready to leave with a data drive containing the only remaining copies of the evidence. He offered Evelyn a trade, urging her to place full blame on Mason in exchange for the code needed to cancel the gas release, his tone carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never once expected to be refused. Evelyn asked Adrian to keep the line open while she considered his conditions carefully. In front of Mason, she stated aloud that the company would announce him as the person responsible for everything. Mason remained silent, though his eyes suggested he was already preparing to finish the task alone if she truly meant what she said, calculating in his mind exactly how many steps stood between him and the second valve without her help. Adrian grew confident and began describing his plan in greater detail than he needed to. He claimed Evelyn had always been too fragile to lead, always dependent on data and advisors rather than her own judgment. He admitted openly to forging Mason's signature, replacing the components, locking Joseph away, and fabricating every incriminating record used against him. Adrian had no idea that Hannah was quietly recording the entire conversation through the restored analog line, her hands trembling slightly as she watched his confession unfold in real time. The recording was sent directly to Connor waiting outside. Evelyn stalled further by asking for the exact code needed to stop the gas release. Adrian provided a string of numbers that Mason recognized instantly as false, one that would trigger the gas early rather than halt it. Mason caught the trap before Evelyn could enter the final digit. He explained calmly that Adrian had never intended to let any of them survive the night, regardless of what she agreed to, and that every promise coming through that line had only ever been another delay tactic dressed up as mercy. Evelyn openly rejected the deal. She declared she would not sacrifice an innocent man merely to protect her own reputation, her voice steadier now than it had been at any point since the ceremony first fell apart. Adrian, furious at her refusal, triggered the release sequence himself out of pure spite. The system now showed 3 minutes remaining. Mason realized the gas flow could be stopped only if 2 mechanical valves positioned at opposite ends of the chamber were opened at exactly the same moment. The distance between them made it impossible for a single person to manage alone. Evelyn volunteered to take the second valve without hesitation. Mason warned her that stray electrical current in that section could injure her badly, his voice carrying more concern for her safety than she had expected from a man she had once ordered removed from her own lobby. She answered that this was her building and the consequences of her own mistake, and she refused to stand at a safe distance one more time that night, the way she had done every single time someone else paid the price for her decisions. Jackson left Joseph under Lucas's protection and rushed toward the parking garage to intercept Adrian before he could escape. Despite his injury, Jackson managed to seal the exit route just as Adrian's vehicle attempted to pull away from the lower level. Adrian grabbed a length of metal pipe from a nearby rack and advanced toward Jackson, his composed executive manner completely gone now, replaced by something far more desperate, while the countdown above them ticked down to 90 seconds remaining. Jackson faced Adrian directly in the underground garage. Adrian was no skilled fighter, but he attacked recklessly, aware that authorities would soon breach the building. Jackson relied on years of experience to subdue him without endangering anyone standing nearby, his injured shoulder screaming in protest with every movement he made. Adrian triggered a remote lock on his vehicle, attempting to destroy the data drive before it could be recovered. Hannah managed to override the command in time using an access code Joseph had provided earlier. Inside the core chamber, Mason and Evelyn began turning their respective valves at the same moment. Evelyn's valve jammed, its shaft warped from the extreme heat inside the chamber. Mason could not leave his own position, since his valve would immediately reseal the moment he released it. He guided her instead to use a metal bar for additional leverage against the stubborn mechanism. Thick smoke and heat made it nearly impossible for her to see clearly what she was doing, her eyes stinging as sweat and soot mixed together on her face. She remembered how patiently Mason had guided her earlier that night and followed his instructions rhythm by rhythm, refusing to let panic take hold of her hands, focusing instead on the sound of his voice cutting steadily through the noise around them. With only 20 seconds remaining on the display, Evelyn's valve finally began to shift. A sudden surge of stray current knocked Mason away from his own control handle entirely. He fell hard against the floor but still managed to hold the lever steady using only his other arm, gritting his teeth against the pain shooting through his body. Evelyn could have escaped through the door that had just opened behind her, yet she turned back instead to help him. Together they pulled the final release lever with everything they had left. The inert gas system deactivated with only 11 seconds remaining on the counter. Breathable air flowed back into the chamber almost immediately. Rescue crews finally broke through the sealed steel doors and poured into the lower levels. Connor arrested Adrian based on the recorded confession, the financial transactions, and the documents Joseph had preserved throughout the ordeal. The board of directors no longer had any way to conceal what had happened that night, the truth already spreading far beyond anyone's ability to contain it now. Evelyn looked over at Mason, exhausted beside the very system he had once designed with his own hands. She understood now that the man her company had once treated as a threat had actually been the only person who never once abandoned them. Even after everything they had taken from him, even after every reason he might have had to walk away and let the tower burn. Jackson walked toward her slowly, glancing first at Mason and then back at Evelyn, and repeated quietly that they had needed this man from the very beginning. They had simply been too proud, he added, to ever recognize it until now, and pride, he suspected, was a far more dangerous thing than any faulty battery cell could ever be. Weeks later, Oraline Systems released the findings of an independent investigation into everything that had happened that night. Adrian and several board members who had assisted him faced formal charges. Every component contract across the company was reviewed and verified from the ground up. Employees who had once been quietly punished for raising safety concerns were invited to share their experiences openly for the first time. Evelyn organized a company-wide gathering inside the very lobby where she had once ordered Mason removed. She did not hide behind a carefully worded statement crafted by the communications department. Instead, Evelyn stood before everyone and admitted openly that she had signed Mason's dismissal without ever meeting him, without verifying an independent source, and without giving him any chance to defend himself. She announced the full restoration of his professional record, along with fair compensation for everything he had lost, and made the original report public for anyone who wished to read it. Evelyn then offered Mason the position of vice president overseeing company-wide safety. Mason declined the title almost immediately, unwilling to become a decorative symbol used to reassure nervous shareholders. He proposed 3 conditions of his own instead. The safety division would need to operate entirely independent of executive leadership, answering to no one who might someday wish to silence it. Every employee would gain the right to halt any system the moment they identified genuine danger, without fear of losing their job over the decision. Every technical warning going forward would be recorded both electronically and on physical paper, so that no single failure could ever erase the truth again. Evelyn accepted every condition without hesitation. Mason agreed to serve as an independent director of system safety, reporting directly to a newly formed oversight committee rather than to Evelyn herself. Lucas was placed in charge of building a training program that finally combined digital literacy with genuine mechanical understanding. Joseph became an honored advisor within the company he had quietly protected for years. Hannah led a new initiative dedicated to protecting employees who came forward with concerns. Jackson and Mason developed a quiet, lasting respect for one another after everything the two of them had endured together. Grace still never appeared directly in the unfolding story, mentioned only once more near the very end, when Mason received a short call and told the person on the other end that he was already on his way home. Evelyn happened to overhear that brief exchange and realized, perhaps for the first time, that Mason had never sought power or recognition at all. He had only wanted to do what was right before returning to the responsibility waiting for him outside these walls. She invited him to share a cup of coffee once the meeting concluded, careful not to make the gesture feel forced or rushed into something it was not yet ready to become. Mason agreed, though he said plainly that whatever came next needed to begin with honesty between them. Evelyn answered that honesty was the only way she wanted to begin anything ever again. As the story closed, the two of them walked together across the very lobby where it had all started. This time, nobody stopped Mason at the door. Employees who had once eyed him with suspicion quietly stepped aside to let him pass without a single word spoken. Jackson remarked that the company had finally found the person it truly needed all along. Mason answered that no company ever needed a single savior standing at its center. What it needed instead was a system honest enough that the truth could never again be shown the door. What happened inside Auraline Systems that night was never really about a broken system or a battery that failed to meet its own standard. It was about a woman who had built her entire sense of leadership around certainty, discovering that certainty without honesty could destroy an innocent life without anyone noticing until it was almost too late. It was about a quiet father who never once asked for an apology, only for the truth to finally stand in the light where it belonged. Real strength was never found in a title, a boardroom, or a carefully tailored suit. It lived instead in the willingness to admit a mistake, to trust the person everyone else had dismissed, and to build something honest enough that no one would ever again be turned away at the door for simply telling the truth.